Is democracy the long road to socialism? That's what Karl Marx said. But then, as free market advocate and economist Friedrich Hayek once bitingly noted, if socialists understood economics, they wouldn't be socialists. Hello and welcome to Icons. I'm your host, Ramesh Damani. Sometimes man makes history, at other times it is history that maketh the man. To discuss the economic history of post-independence India, I'm joined by someone who has not only studied but has also walked the corridors of power. He's a globally recognized economist, former vice chairman of Niti Aayog, professor and author of over 20 books, including his latest work, The Nehru Development Model. Please help me welcome Arvind Panagariya. Mr. Arvind, welcome to our show, welcome to Icons.
Thank you, Ramesh. It's a great pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. For the benefit of our younger viewers, Arvind, can you please explain to me what was the Nehru Development Model?
Okay. So let me state it briefly for the young readers. What Nehru conceived was that in order to industrialize and achieve high growth rates, he needed heavy industry. That meant things like steel, machinery, chemicals, engineering goods, everything that requires very large volume of investment. So the heavy industry, therefore, was going to be the engine of growth and industrialization. Then Nehru felt that for employment, it had to be the small industry, which, in those days of Gandhian times, was something the cottage industry, or it's also known as the household industry. Nehru himself uses the word hand industry, meaning not much capital or not any capital, just using your hands and producing some of the light manufactures. So employment and consumer goods in the hand industry or cottage industry, and the engine of growth and industrialization, heavy industry. Now, that immediately, means that you are not going to rely on the markets, because markets will not necessarily take the investment into heavy industry. So in order to ensure that investment actually went into heavy industry, you had to have the public sector do it.
And you created what is called the commanding sector of the Indian economy?
Exactly. So take the commanding heights, that they go to the public sector, plus any of the other heavy investments, since a lot of that was also left open to the private sector. Private sector had to be subject to licensing, because unless you required the large investments to have a license or obtain a license from the government, they will not necessarily invest in the heavy industry in which the government wanted to channel their investment.
Yeah, Arvind, but what surprised me when I read your book is that
Yes.
Nehru actually stigmatized international trade. I mean, that seems so counterintuitive. Was that in many aspects his original sin?
Well, it was really behind the entire heavy industry approach that he devised. Because you see, if you are going to choose not to engage in international trade, then for investment, you need machinery. How else are you going to create new industries? For new industries, you always need machinery. And so therefore, from the desire to achieve self-sufficiency or not engage in international trade, the heavy industry approach automatically followed. And that had devastating effects, because you see, what this did was to put capital at one end with hardly any labor, and at the other extreme, it put labor in this cottage industry and hand industries with hardly any capital. Now, these two extremes were the worst allocation of both capital and labor. So the labor productivity did poorly and capital productivity did poorly also. And the process of development was very exclusionary, because people were not involved. Your big factor of production, the abundant factor of production, was labor. You wanted to increase the productivity of labor, but that couldn't happen without giving it some capital.
Arvind, 1950s, we talked about socialism and self-sufficiency. 2025, we're talking about Aatmanirbhar Bharat. Are they basically two sides of the same coin, or is there a distinction between the two?
No, no. Actually, what Nehru sought was complete self-sufficiency. He didn't expect to start there, and he didn't start there, so trade was still happening. But the objective was certainly to get to a point such that our production basket was aligned fully to our consumption basket, and therefore we'll simply not trade with the rest of the world. That is not the current idea of Atmanirbhar Bharat is. I think it is much more about being able to pay our bills, that whatever we import, we ought to be able to pay for it through our exports or through other means, but we should not be dependent on anybody. So this conception, and as you know, our really trade to GDP ratio is in the range of around 45%. So there is no attempt whatsoever to kind of, move in the direction in which we'll eliminate international trade. So these are two very different concepts.
Arvind, but maybe we are being pushed involuntarily into the trade environment. Trump, who's leading perhaps slightly in the US polls, suggests that he'll put tariffs in place. The world that was globalizing post, say, 2000 has suddenly taken a backward step. So are we all going to beggar our neighbor policy that brought the world to ruin in the 1930s?
Yeah, so there is certainly a bit of movement in that direction. And we have seen, both the United States and China impose import duties on each other. And Trump has also threatened, currently, I think, if he is to come into the White House with tariffs against India.
And on everything, he's basically costing 60%, 80% tariffs, which, doesn't make sense to me from an economic point of view.
No, absolutely it doesn't. And maybe this is his ploy to get us to negotiate our own tariffs a bit down. His complaint is that he wants to impose these tariffs on us because our tariffs are high. So maybe there'll be some negotiation, but that's down the road after the election, and it also depends on Trump coming to the White House. But overall, in spite of this bit movement, in the policies towards protection lately, we should not forget that the world economy, because of the past liberalization, still remains incredibly open. The global trade, global exports are in the range of about $25 trillion for merchandise and another $7 trillion for services. So it is still a very large market. And we also had sanctions against Russia and so forth. But none of that has really actually stopped the growth in trade.
I want to take you back to the 50s. We had a choice that time between two prime ministers, perhaps. Nehru on one hand, Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel on the other hand. Would economic history would have been different if the roles had been switched and Vallabhbhai Patel had become prime minister?
Oh, very, very much so. Very much so.
Really?
I posed that actually hypothetical in the last chapter of this book, The Nehru Development Model. And what I say is that, look, let's imagine that the age profiles of Sardar Patel and Pandit Nehru were switched, so that it is Nehru who would have left the scene in December 1950 and Patel who would have survived till May 1964. In that situation, I think, knowing what we do know about Sardar Patel, I conclude in that chapter that we would not have had this heavy kind of dependence of heavy industry. We would have given greater priority to agriculture. And we would certainly not have this massive public sector manufacturing. Sardar Patel very much believed in the private enterprise. And so those features would not have been there. On import restrictions, I think that's a little bit of a harder call. Probably some import restrictions would still have been there. Also, there is one sort of interesting point, which I don't have in the book, but it occurs to me that, one of the people who understood the problems with Nehru's model was B.R. Shenoy, and he came from Gujarat. So, it's entirely possible that Sardar Patel would have also listened a bit more to B.R. Shenoy, which Nehru kind of summarily dismissed. So, certainly I would I think there is, by the way, on this very question, there is a very short interview by J.R.D. Tata where he says exactly this, that, had Patel been younger and Nehru older, then the economic situation and the plan that we adopted would have been totally different. I mean, those are his words, roughly.
It's truly amazing how history changes sometimes with just the man. But
Yes.
let me bring you forward in history. There was an avowed socialist who became a prime minister and a champion for free economic reforms. July 24th, 1991, Manmohan Singh gave what was the path-breaking liberalization budget. Do you remember the time, and do you remember what your thoughts were on that day?
I distinctly remember I was working at the World Bank at the time. At the time, we did not realize the difference between what was in the budget and what was in the industrial policy. What we actually saw and what got played up actually very much was the industrial policy. It was not necessarily the budget, but it was released on the same day. Industrial policy was tabled in the parliament the same day, a couple of hours before the presentation. So that's what we heard a lot about. And that was, of course, very, very satisfying that finally the kinds of reforms we were hoping for had taken place. I also remember that we were a little bit disappointed because there had also been talk, at least at the World Bank, about an exit policy, which means, dealing with some of the labor law issues. That were actually not dealt with in what was announced on that day in July 1991. But that's okay. I think quite a bit got done.
People have often said that China's entry into the WTO was a more important event, economic event, than even 9/11. Would you agree?
Those are very two different kinds of events. So really, I think it's an unfair comparison and difficult to pick one or the other. One is a tragedy. The other is much more of a sort of positive development in the global economy. They were both very, very important events, and they influenced our lives actually practically for decades to come.
Another domino was, of course, 9/11, when the Twin
Yes.
Towers fell. Was that the
Yes.
actual domino that kick-started liberalization?
Well, liberalization had been ongoing actually, and the big event in liberalization history really was the formation of the World Trade Organization, which was January 1995. That had happened. Now, what 9/11 did do was actually solidify that liberalization, because I distinctly remember President George Bush, who was presiding over the United States, really took this view that, we are not going to be cowed down by this attack, and nobody is going to change our way of living. And that also galvanized him into then launching what became later on the Doha round of trade negotiations. And that, although ultimately did not succeed, it nevertheless actually very much helped in keeping the markets very open and in ensuring that the roots of the World Trade Organization were deepened. So it was, in this sense, very helpful.
Arvind, according to you, you study history, you study economics, who was the politician, who was the champion of the free world that we saw? Was it Thatcher? Was it Reagan? Who would you ascribe a lot of the prosperity that we saw in the 90s and 2002?
No, they were both very critical, actually. Reagan in the United States and Margaret Thatcher in the United Kingdom. Their views were very well aligned. And it is not a stretch to say that a lot of the economic expansion that the United States saw after Ronald Reagan, particularly during Clinton years, owed much to what Ronald Reagan had done during the 1980s. His contribution was pivotal, and obviously for the global economy, Reagan was far more important for the simple fact that the US economy is significantly larger. And it also, in some ways, you can argue that, the fact that China had opened up and it gained entry into the WTO in at Doha, actually, when the Doha round was kicked off soon after 9/11, 2001. Um, at that time. So Chinese growth, therefore, also owes to some degree to what Reagan did, because all this economic expansion of the United States was further kind of fueled by the growth of the Chinese trade with the United States. So, all these factors proved quite important.
Okay, Arvind, let's get back to the present and modern day India. The Indian economy is $3 trillion, billionaires are worth $1 trillion. Does that worry you in any way?
The billionaires. No, they don't worry me, actually. I've written about this. First of all, when we think of the wealth of the billionaires as a proportion of the GDP, that's a wrong comparison, because wealth is a stock figure and GDP is a flow figure. So that comparison itself actually, overstates. It overstates. I mean, we have to think of the income of the billionaires as a proportion of the GDP, which is also large, admittedly, but nothing like, the whole stock of wealth. Having said that, look, we have seen the days without billionaires. I mean, I am old enough, actually. I lived through it, and fine, there were no billionaires, but the poverty was rampant. Ultimately, the poverty was thrown into the dustbin of history, largely, at least the extreme poverty, by the wealth accumulation.
But Arvind, the country you reside in, the United States, has an estate tax. Is India ready for an estate tax, you feel?
I would not advise it. I would not advise it, because in the end, the United States estate tax doesn't raise a whole lot of revenue. And actually, the exemption limits are quite high. For the bulk of the population, the estate tax just doesn't kick in, because there's a fairly high limit. And then there are all sorts of
not that high, about $15 million. I think that's the estate tax.
Right, limit. but then if you form trusts, etc., then you can still escape that. So a lot of billionaires will create actually these philanthropic trusts. Yeah, I mean, that's how you have the Carnegie Endowment for Peace. You got, Ford
Rockefeller Foundation.
Rockefeller Foundation, yeah. So,
yeah. But Arvind, let me bring you to the present. We hope a wealth tax doesn't come. At least I speak on behalf of the Lal Street. But between Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, economically, who's better for the world?
That's a Hobson's choice. But you are asking economically, well, it is hard to tell, because, I was going to say, perhaps on the whole, if I compare the terms of Donald Trump from 16 to 20 and of Biden-Harris from 20 to 24, economy certainly overall performed a lot better under Trump. But, from the global perspective, Trump also is a mixed bag, because of the prospects of further escalation of trade restrictions. On the other hand, we haven't seen a great deal of performance under Biden either. So, and particularly the inflation has been quite high. So it really feels like a Hobson's choice, I'm glad I don't have to vote, I remain a proud Indian citizen, so.
Right, thank you. Arvind, but final question. You said you're an Indian citizen. If the Prime Minister invited you to a round table and said, give me 3 things that I should do in the next budget, what would they be?
My views on this are well known. We do need to continue with some of the economic reforms, because in the end, that is the way to harness the energies of the 140 crore Indians. The Prime Minister is doing fabulous job of building up India's infrastructure. I've never seen this kind of pace and this kind of scale of building infrastructure, including the digital infrastructure. But all around, Prime Minister is
Bombay is
really
transformed, sir. Bombay is transformed. The infrastructure is
exactly,
just world class finally.
exactly. I mean, I've gone through the coastal
Coastal
road,
road, yes, sir.
and I've gone to the Atal Setu as well. And it's marvelous. I think in Delhi, I see it, the kinds of buildings like Bharat Mandapam, the new parliament building, the kinds of buildings we never constructed, we are doing it. So I think on that front, fantastic. Regionally, I think fantastic. Northeast, for example, which had been somewhat neglected. The Prime Minister is really transforming Northeast as well. So all that is very good, but we also need to harness the energy, not just of the government, but also the 140 crore Indians. And for that, policy reform continues to be very important. So my priority number one at this point would be to ensure that the labor laws, four labor codes, which had been passed, enacted by the parliament in 2019 and 2020, they ought to be implemented without delay. Second, I think privatization program, which is in a way the government's official policy, because there is a public enterprise policy that the government put in place during the COVID era, when the COVID year was upon us at that time, under which the government has separated four strategic sectors in which it plans to keep the public sector enterprises, but in all the remaining non-strategic sectors, it has committed to actually privatize.
Privatizing, yes.
I think we need to proceed with that privatization. So that will be my second very important area of reform. Third, I think banking also, because we had repeated episodes of NPAs, and these episodes each time take up large volume of taxpayer money to be recapitalized, and we infuse something more than about 3 lakh crore rupees into the public sector banks. We never had to put any money in the private sector banks to recapitalize them. So that will save a lot of resources. It will also make financial sector much more vibrant. So that has to happen.
Your third thing.
Some states have to do. Very, very important area of reform is urban. I think, urbanization in India is not progressing as well as it has to, and no country transforms into a modern economy without massive urbanization.
I think the excuse they always say is that there's no public consensus for privatization in India, that we actually like our public sector. Is that true?
Well, no. Look, I mean, privatization has happened. I mean, Air India was privatized. Then there was a very big steel company, Neelanchal, which has been privatized. Some of the smaller enterprises have also been privatized. But we need to get to, bigger. It's true that privatization is more contentious, more difficult also. I think bureaucratically, it's very, very difficult actually, because so many hurdles. And somebody or the other always ends up in the Supreme Court. And, when you have reached the last stage of unloading the enterprise, somebody would come in and challenge that.
You're economic historians, you'll remember when Bajpayee ji tried to do this, he was taught by George Fernandez, who was the industry minister at that time.
Yes. No. I mean, there were a lot of opposition. And actually, we know that, BPCL had come up for privatization at the time.
Yeah,
but
it did.
Then the parliament refused to actually amend the law.
Yeah.
Because they had been nationalized, and so you had to denationalize in a way.
But quick question. I mean, given the fact that the present government has had at least a clear majority in parliament and in Rajya Sabha, are they moving slow on this? Quick answer.
Well, that, I mean, my guess is, this is anybody's guess, but the government in the 2024 election, BJP did not get the kind of majority that it was expected to get. So there is a little bit of solidification perhaps, but I know the Prime Minister's mind, and I know the Prime Minister. I think he's trying to address a few things to to consolidate the political base. And I have no doubt that
It will happen.
we will come back to, yes, it
You
will
know,
happen. Actually, today, by the way, Financial Express actually carried a news on labor laws, for example.
Correct,
they've
today.
been, but today saw a report, front page report in Financial Express saying that the government is getting ready, and early next year, in January, February, very likely these will be implemented.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I actually wanted to ask you about your brother. I just it just slipped the question. Maybe some other show will do it. We'll talk about him because I know he had a profound influence on you from the book.
Yes.
So
Yes.
thank you at least for sharing it privately with us, sir.
Thank you, Ramesh.
Thank you, sir.